All right. So in this video, I want to take a look at the capstone for Excel, which has been reduced to a single part. We're jumping straight into part 2 for the Excel capstone. Unlike part 1 for Word, I don't really think there's an awful lot of opportunity for learning with the part 1 file without any additional guidance for the Excel capstone. And so I have given you immediate access to part 2, which is now just renamed as Excel Capstone. So there is no part 1. You'll see part 1 is available in my Brightspace shell, but it's hidden to you. And so we're completely skipping Excel part 1. I've already removed it from the gradable components. I've taken the 3% that Excel part 1 would have been worth, and I've wrapped it into part 2. Part 1, like the word capstone, was worth 3%. Part 2 was going to be worth 10%, like the word capstone. But now you're just going to do a single step with access to the rubric for 13% in Excel. And it's due on December 1st, which is 1, 2, 3, just over 3 weeks. Just over like 3 weeks and a day. It's due. So there's plenty of time to complete it. I know that some of you are balancing a number of different courses and you've got all kinds of priorities. So normally we would have this due a little bit earlier, a couple of days before the MOS exam maybe, but December 1st is going to work for us for this particular assessment. There is still a requirement to be in a group, to be enrolled in a group. And so you won't see the Excel Capstone folder at all under assignments until you join a group. Now, I just had a look, and of the 38 students enrolled in this section, only 24 students are currently enrolled in a group, which means there are 14 students, 14 of you, that have not yet joined a group for Excel, and at this point do not have access to the file or the rubric in this folder because you can't see the folder. And so what you need to do, if you have been skipping classes and didn't listen to the explanation that was given in class, you need to go to Course Tools in Brightspace, go back into groups, just like you did for the Word assignment. I have to change the groups that are displayed. The Word capstone groups are displayed by default for me, so I need to change it to the Excel groups. Adding yourself into a Word group is not sufficient to complete the Excel capstone, and you don't have to remain in the groups. If you completed the Word capstone part 2 in a group, you don't have to stay in that group. You don't have to work with the same people. You can work on your own. So it looks like there's a bunch of people in this section that have elected to work in groups. I see groups of 3, groups of 2, no groups of 4, which is interesting, but okay, I don't mind at all. And then a bunch of people, it looks like, are going to attempt part 2 on their own, which honestly, I personally think is the best approach. It creates more marking for me, but I don't mind that. I would rather people worked on their own and completed 100% of the steps themselves, because I think that best prepares you for the MOS exam. If you divide the work and you do some of it and then you offload a whole bunch of work, some of the worksheets in the file, to another person and you're not directly involved in it, you're not really going to learn anything about the steps that were taken in that worksheet and the functions that were leveraged, or the functionality that was leveraged. And so if this was me and I was taking this course, I'd want to do it on my own, I think. But you don't have to. You can join a group. Even if you want to work on your own, you're still expected to join a group. It needs to be a group of one, and then you'll get access to the assignment. And so I've removed the prerequisite that requires a file to be submitted to the part 1 Capstone folder, because it no longer doesn't exist for you anymore. And so you should, once you've joined a group, you should be able to get access to part 2 and the rubric, which is in here. The rubric for the Excel Capstone is very, very similar to the rubric that we used for the Word Capstone. And so the functions that you're expected to use in the application within this file are broken out by tab. And so options from the Home tab, cell alignment options, appropriate number formatting, some conditional formatting that needs to be used. We're going to look at conditional formatting next week. Cell styles have been used, and it says minimum of 3 different cell styles. I don't love that because I don't personally use cell styles a lot. I quite like the total cell style, and every so often for titles, I'll use one of the heading cell styles. I'm sure you'll be able to find a way to use 3 different cell styles, because you're going to have a minimum of 6 worksheets, and there's plenty of data to format. And so this is an easy rubric criteria, but I'm not personally a big fan of cell styles. I like to make my own edits and my own formats usually. So I'm just pointing that out. You need to use a table. Obviously, that can be found in the Insert tab. Once you've used the table, you need to configure some of the options. So we talked about this in last week's classes. You can insert a total row. You can insert first column, last column to set them bold. You can remove the filter button. All of those are different table options. And so table styles, the table configuration options. You need to leverage something in there. Pivot table is something that we're going to look at this week. Pivot tables are one of my favorite features in Excel for data analysis. And so I'm going to record a video that covers pivot tables, and we're going to introduce pivot tables in our classes this next week. Minimum of 2 charts inserted. This is easy. I'm going to show you some examples of student files that were submitted during the spring summer semester, student files that received very high grades. And what you'll find is that in most of the worksheets, in fact, that's not true. In half of their worksheets, there are charts, but there's often more than 1 chart in a single worksheet. And so I'll show you what that could look like. Spark lines are a different type of chart. I'll demonstrate these, and these are actually already demonstrated in a video. The part 2 of the skills assessment video is charts and spark lines, and so this is already covered in a video, but we're going to do it again because it's likely to come up in your MOS exam. Just like Word, need to insert a hyperlink somewhere. In the page layout tab, going to change the theme, going to change the colors, going to change the font. All of those items are pulled directly from the Word Capstone assignment. So you're doing the same thing just in Excel instead of Word. Print areas set is an Excel specific rubric item. And so we're going to look at print options next week. It's not something you need to do until the very end of the file. So you wouldn't do this near the beginning of the assignment anyway. You would fix the data, format the data, leverage some functions, and then when everything is done and the file would be in a position where you could print, at that point you would go in and then set the print settings, paper size, orientation, repeating header rows, those kind of things. How much data you actually want to print to individual pages. Title rows and columns set to print on certain worksheets. This is a confusing rubric item that I'm not responsible for, but I also can't change it. I don't like the wording of it. And so I'll show you what this means when we look at the print options. Basically, if you've got data that extends to more than one page, if it doesn't all fit on a single page, and it extends to page 2, you can have either the first column or the first row of the data in a table repeat at the top of the subsequent printed pages. So if there's 3 printed pages, you would end up with data that extends from page 1 onto page 2, but then in the very first row on page 2, the header row would be repeated, so that you wouldn't need to look at the data in conjunction with page 1, because that would be the only page that had a header row in it. See, we did this in Word with a table. We repeated 2 rows, a row that contained a title and then a row that contained headers, when the table split across multiple pages, and then they just repeated. So the same functionality exists in Excel, and we need to leverage it in the Capstone assignment. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of worksheets in the assignment where the data would extend to 2 pages. I think it's literally just the last worksheet where that can happen, but we only need to use it once, so it doesn't really matter. We just need to identify which data we're going to use it for. Printed 1 page wide by 1 page tall. Fair enough. If function. VLOOKUP, well, it says if function and it says equals if, and so this gives you the function, right? The function name. And then there's some inconsistency with the very next rubric item. And it says lookup function used. Now, we haven't looked at the actual lookup function, because on its own, it doesn't do anything that we can leverage with the data that we've been working with. What we have looked at is the group of lookup functions. And so we started with VLOOKUP, but then we also looked at and demonstrated HLOOKUP, which is just the same as VLOOKUP, but where the data arrangement is horizontal. We may have looked at and talked about XLOOKUP. It's not something you really need to know, but it is incredibly useful. And we may have looked at and demonstrated index match, nested index match, to do the same thing as a VLOOKUP or a HLOOKUP. But there is a function called equals lookup, and that's not what this rubric item is referring to. There is the way that the data is arranged in the Capstone file. It's set up in 2 worksheets for you to use VLOOKUP. In fact, no, one of them is HLOOKUP and one of them is VLOOKUP. And so this really should say lookup type functions used, or it should say VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP used. It's not my assignment. It's not my rubric. I don't love the way that things are written in the rubric, but it is what it is. That's why I'm here to explain it. Text functions have been used. Most people will just use the concat or the text join function to do this, but there is some scope in the file to use left and right, or left or right, upper and lower, and the proper function as well. You don't have to, but there's a rubric item. And so when you look at the data, you've got a group of functions that you can pull from to manipulate the data so that it makes sense to you and to the people that you're preparing the file for. Nested function used. This isn't actually something I'm particularly concerned about. Nested functions are advanced. If you can use a nested function, then that's amazing. But this isn't a rubric item I'm going to pay a lot of attention to. I'm going to see what work you did, and if there's something that I can say, yeah, you did this, then I'm going to give it to you. Nested functions won't be in your MOS exam, so they're not in our final summative assessment, and so I'm not particularly bothered about whether this gets done or not. I don't want to overcomplicate things. Statistical functions, I'm going to classify as sum, average, min, max, count, those kind of functions. If you actually want to use some of the statistical group of functions and use higher end functions, like some of the more analytical functions, like standard deviation, variance, covariance, then you can. But if you use the sum function, which everyone I think will, probably even in the first worksheet, or the average function, or the count function, or a combination of them, min, max, those kind of things, then I'll give you the marks for the statistical functions. Minimum of 2 named ranges. In the file, this should be really easy given that there's 6 worksheets, and we need at least 2 types of lookup function across 2 different worksheets. And so personally, I would do the VLOOKUP and the HLOOKUP with where the table arrays are named range. That would account for this rubric item quite easily. One worksheet set to show formulas. There's a button on the formulas tab that says show formulas. And instead of displaying answers in cells in that worksheet, it will instead display the formula that calculates the answer. And so this is one worksheet set to show formulas. It doesn't really make sense to score on a 4-point scale where you can have basic, developing, and proficient. It should really be 0 or 1. Either you don't have a worksheet that contains formulas, or you do. And so no one will get basic or developing for this rubric item. You're either going to get 0 or you're going to get 3, because that's either it's like true or false. I don't really see any point in doing marks, but 1 and 2 doesn't make sense. In the data tab, you're expected to use some sort of custom sort. We're going to look at this next week. It can be very powerful. I'm more interested in this though, because this is what would be in your MOS exam. I mean, I suppose custom sort could be on your MOS exam, but I didn't see it during the spring summer semester. Whereas I did see a couple of multi-level sorts be required. Duplicates removed for obvious reasons. I don't know that there are actually many duplicates in the file at all. But we're working with, in a lot of the worksheets, we're working with monetary data. And so if money's involved, this is really important. We don't want money to calculate incorrectly because the same record occurs more than once. This would be incredibly poor, incredibly bad. Data broken out into columns. This is talking about the second worksheet where you've got combined values in a single column, in column A, and you need to split that range of text in that column across, I think it's 6 columns that it'll create. And so we did the same function in Microsoft Word. It's called text to columns. That tool exists in Excel as well, and is arguably more useful in Excel. But that's what this is talking about. No spelling or grammar issues upon submission. And that's important because there's a bunch of spelling mistakes that were entered purposefully so that you could spot them and fix them. And there's at least one in the worksheet tab names. Every so often, students will submit files and they will miss that spelling mistake, which obviously isn't a good thing. And so don't want to see any spelling mistakes or grammar issues in the submission. The spelling and grammar checker works exactly the same way as it works in Microsoft Word. Accessibility needs to be checked, just like in the Word assignment. You're going to insert a comment in this file somewhere. You're going to insert a note in this file somewhere. You'll only be able to do both of these if you're using Excel 365. If you're using anything other than Excel 365, you won't be able to insert the kind of comment that it's talking about, because in Excel, what are notes now in Office 365 used to be the comments. That's what the comments looked like. That's how they worked. And then they've reclassified that functionality as notes instead, and then they've introduced the same comment functionality that you saw in Word, where you can have a conversation, you can reply and resolve comment threads. And so these are things I'm not really that bothered about. because I don't use them an awful lot personally. Either could be in your MOS exam, so you're still going to need to do it, but I don't really care how you use it. Want the file submitted as an Excel document. Now you're going to download the file in a template file that supports macros. And then when you save it, you need to save it as a regular XLSX file. This is the standard regular Excel workbook file type. And we don't want it to be saved as a template file or a file that supports macros. But you do need to submit an Excel file. Handful of people didn't submit Word documents for the Word Capstone. They only submitted PDFs. And if I can't go into menus and check the settings that we used, that the rubric asks you to use, then you can't have marks for them. And so you won't get any marks for anything in this rubric other than you submitted the workbook as a PDF. You would get full marks for this if you just submitted a PDF, but I'm not giving you marks for anything else. I need to be able to go into things like the properties group to make sure that you set a minimum of 2 properties. I want to see, just like Word, if you're working in a group or group member names, either in the properties group, in the header or the footer, perhaps you could create a cover worksheet as to stand in as a cover page. You've got a large degree of flexibility as to how you approach this. And then headers and footers are used consistently throughout the workbook. And that just means that if there's 6 worksheets in the file, each one of them is expected to have a header and a footer. And that's it. Not too complicated in terms of the rubric items. But some of the data that you're going to be working with is awkward. And so this is the file that you're going to use. Ignore the fact that it's called part 2. I just didn't rename the file. It's the exact same file with a slightly different name that you would have downloaded in part 1. Nothing in the file has changed, just the name. So I didn't change the name. I've left it alone. When you download it, this is what you're going to get. This is the first worksheet in this file. And it's really ugly. Certainly not something that I would ever want to deliver to a manager or take to a meeting. The work that I submit is representative of my abilities. And so this isn't something I would ever consider submitting. This is awful. And it's awful on purpose. It's not random, right? When you opened up the Word part 1 file, there was like an orange page color applied. There was an obnoxious border applied to the page on every single page throughout the document. There was a whole bunch of tracked changes in that file where amendments had been made, and you could see the tracking history, the editing history of the document. And so in this file, in the Excel capstone, we have some of the same things that we want you to do. We want you to assess whether something looks presentable or not. And if it doesn't, or if it doesn't make sense, or if something's been formatted in such a way that you would never actually do it, like this, where the columns are too narrow to display the actual values, so they're hashed out like this. They're actually fine. There are data values in each of these columns. You just can't see them because the column width is too narrow. And then even when you do fix that, you can see that some of these values, if it's not a whole number, are displayed as fractions. Now you can see up here in the number format group that these cells are formatted as fractional data, but you could just change the number format and have them display as decimal numerical values like this, and that would be far more appropriate. So I'm just going to undo that for a second because this is how your file opens up. We have data in what looks like 3 different ranges that's related, and we need to make it look far more presentable than this. You can tell that it's time-based data if you're paying attention to what's actually in the cells. We've got January, what looks like February, March, April, May, June, all the way through to December. So it's a year's worth of data for whatever company that is represented in the accounting worksheet. And these are fixed costs, this range of data. They're not all actually fixed costs. Some of them appear to be variable, but it's fine. These are variable costs in the second range of data. And then we've got an outputs area where we have some calculations being performed, or where we will have some calculations being performed. We have a row that contains sales figures for each of the months that year. So this is our revenue. We need to figure out the total fixed costs in row 24, the variable fixed cost total in row 25 in that row, the amount of profit, which should be the revenue for January minus the sum of the costs, the fixed and the variable costs. That would leave the profit amount. And then you need to calculate the percent profit in row 27. And the way that I would do that is I would take the profit amount and I would just divide it by 100% of the revenue. So this first worksheet obviously looks a mess. It's easy enough to fix. And so I'm going to demonstrate what I would do with it in a minute. And then once we've looked at some of the options that we've got with this first worksheet, because obviously there are no instructions, and so we're just going to do what makes sense. We're going to work with the rubric and identify where we can leverage certain functionality. We'll look at the data in the financial services worksheet, where we have these combined values, these combined text entries, all in column 8, and we need to split this data across several columns before we can work on it, and I'll demonstrate this worksheet too. The rest of the worksheets are a lot cleaner to start off with. They're not perfect, and there are things that you would want to change in them, but there's nothing broken in terms of the formatting in the other 4 worksheets. It's the first 2 that are the most awkward in terms of the layout of the data and how clean it looks, that you can actually leverage some of the functions. So before I show you the way that I would approach this, I want to show you examples of what students submitted during the spring-summer semester. Spring-summer semester was the first time that we actually ran this assignment, and we thought it went quite well, so we made a couple of minor modifications, and then we're running it again with you guys in the fall, and then we'll figure out whether it works and what else we can change for next semester once we get submissions for this semester, and we can figure out what's working and what's not. So during the spring summer semester, we had a range of pretty good submissions, and so this is the first worksheet that one of the students during the spring summer semester put together, and you can see that it actually looks really quite tidy. Is it perfect? No. Do I love everything about it? No, but a lot of work has gone into this first worksheet. Obviously, they fixed the formatting, and we're going to do that too when I demonstrate what I would do. And then they've turned each one of these rows, each one of these ranges, into a separate table. And if you look at the data that they've got, their headings from row number 4, where we've got monthly, the months, January through December, and then obviously the totals for our column headings, that only actually appears in the first row for the fixed costs range of data. It doesn't appear in the start file for the fixed costs and the outputs ranges. So what this student has done is repeat that header row. And they will have inserted the data before they turned these into tables. And I don't hate it. Do we need this row? No, because if we're reading the data down the columns, you establish in the first range of data the values in this column are the values from March. We don't necessarily need that header row to be repeated, but it does work the way that they formatted this data. I don't hate it. They also have total rows for the fixed cost range and the variable cost range in each of these tables. And what that tells me is that in the table tools tab, they converted the data into a table, and then they came here and turned on the total row to add row totals, column totals to each of these months in rows 12 and 21. They've also used, I can see in column N in the table, they've used the last, where is it? Did they? Oh, they might have formatted this manually. Yeah, they formatted it manually. You can see here. They just came and said, make these bold. I would have assumed, I probably assumed while I was marking it, that what they did was use last column. And you can see that I'm turning it on and off and nothing happens now. If you look at the first column in column A, if I click first column, it makes the values in that range bold, which is why I thought that they had used the last column feature in the tables, because the total column N is bold, whereas the rest of the values are not. But that's fine. The formatting ends up looking the same anyway. It's not a table option, but they did consciously go through and bold these, which I quite like. I also quite like that in their total row, they have centered the word total instead of leaving it left aligned like this, which is how it would insert. I don't know that I would have centered it. It works. It works here. Like it does look good. It starts out left aligned. I personally would have probably indented twice, so it wouldn't be quite in the center. But I would want the same thing to happen. The reason that they've formatted it like this, and the reason that I would format it like this, is because as we read down in this table, all of these items are rows of data that then generate totals in row 12. And I wouldn't want anybody to think that, let's turn that, can't even turn it off as bold because it's set as the total row. I wouldn't want anyone to think this is just another record of data. And so because it's formatted the way that it is, they centered it like this. It provides, as we read down and you hit row 12, there's nothing left aligned in that cell. And then the value is also bold. And so it lets you know there's something different about this row. It's not the same as what came before it. Something has changed now. And so this is where we put our totals. I quite like their table design. I don't love the whatever color this is, puce or pink or orange. Like, I don't know what color it is, but I don't love that color. I do like pastel colors. If this was a little bit paler, maybe I'd prefer it. But it is what it is. What I do like is that their header row and their total row are different colors, completely different shades. Quite like that they're consistent. And I like that it makes it really obvious that rows 12 and 21 and then rows 29 and 30 are different from everything else. It really stands out. They centered the titles. That's also that's also a hyperlink. I didn't know it was going to do that when I opened it up. It's not, you can't tell that that's a hyperlink unless you hover over it, and then yeah, it takes you to a web page that explains um, the, what was it? Average fixed costs. Don't really know why these are not averages, but fine. They center the title, and then it's in what looks like is this a cell? It's one cell. It's one cell that's been filled with black. It was merged and centered, so it looks like a shape or a big text box or something. And then they've made the title in there quite large, with a highly contrasting color for the font. It looks good. Like it's easy to read, and that's the goal here. I think what I would have liked, the only way that I would have improved this for this student is I would have turned off the filter buttons in the first rows of these tables so that it looks a little bit less busy. If you're not using the filter button for either filtering or for sorting the in cell dropdown, then I would turn it off. It's turned on by default, so if you turn it off, I know that you've taken an extra step, and I can reward you with some marks. But I quite like this. They've obviously got their amounts, they've got the calculations in order, and then they've got three different charts, fixed cost chart, variable cost chart, and then they've got an outputs range. So what they've done is for each of these tables that they've created, they've generated a different chart. And I suppose it works. I quite like that the background color for the chart is the same as the banded rows, the fill color in the tables. And then outputs, what are we looking at? Profit values across the months. Yeah, okay. I like that. 12 months worth of data. What I don't like is that the chart is so condensed that you can't actually read these correctly. I would have made a slightly bigger chart or put it in its own worksheet. I like what they've done here, and then they've sized it so that they're not actually equidistant. There's less space between these two charts than there is these two charts. But it does look quite good. Like if you look at the full page, it looks nice. It looks clean. Personally, when it comes to, can I select the chart? Why can I not select the chart? I can right click the chart and select it, but I can't left click the chart and select it. Okay. What I would have done is why are my tabs not working? This is irritating. In the alignment group of the chart format tab, there's a snap to grid option. And so what you can do when you resize your chart, you can see it's now snapping to cell borders. Can't see the cell borders, but they're there. Have you, please? So if you wanted them all to be absolutely perfectly aligned in terms of positioning in the worksheet, you can see it snap into the column width now. This would allow you to do that, turning on snap to the grid, and so this could have looked a little bit cleaner, but it's fine. Like they did a really good job. This is certainly full marks for this first worksheet. Do not hate it at all. And if we look at what someone else did, that's one person. Everyone kind of did something very similar, and so you would almost think those two students worked together, because you've got three separate, are these tables? Yeah, they are tables. They don't look like tables because they've turned off the filter row. But if you click in it and you get the table design tab, then obviously it's a table. They did the same thing. They repeated the header rows for each range. They've inserted total rows for each of these ranges. There's some spark lines in use over here, which is fine, even though I don't adore it. And then they did three different charts again. Not the expectation, not even something that I asked them to do in class. but I don't hate it. In fact, there's a lot of similarity between that first person and then this second person. Like, they clearly didn't work together because there's some things that you would have done. This placeholder column one label is because that cell was empty. And so Excel knows that this is going to be the header row because these cells are populated. And we say, yes, our first row is going to be our header row. But then because we're also selecting the values from this column, and this cell was empty, it fills it with a placeholder column one label. And so that first person actually did more work. They changed it from column one to type of costs to account for these. Type of costs is a good label. Category or categories would also be a perfectly appropriate label here. The first one looks cleaner, like the data's cleaner. It looks more professional. The second one, they've done a lot of the same work, but it doesn't look as well-rounded. It doesn't look as polished. It's interesting though that first person used pie charts for the fixed cost chart and then the variable cost chart. And then this person has used, well, if we go to chart design and we say change chart type, they've used, this is called tree map, but it is effectively the exact same as, it's almost identical to a pie chart in that the size of the segment is dictated by the value. So these are not equal column widths. Overhead cost is clearly the largest value in this range because the segment in this chart is the largest. Rent and salaries look really similar. They could even be identical. It's difficult to see what those values are in this chart because there's no labels or anything. You would have to go back to the table to see what the values are. But if you're looking at fixed costs in relation to one another, overhead costs by far the greatest amount, and then supplies by far the smallest amount. That was the smallest amount cost. But this works like a pie chart. Pie charts work the same. It's by size of the segment, and it's related to all of the other data points that make up the rest of the segments. And so these are effectively the same as pie charts. And then we've got a column chart, which is different from the first example. And we've got three different, what have we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 different data values plotted. We've got the sales amounts, the fixed cost totals, the variable cost totals, and then the profit. And so you can see what each of those looks like. It's fairly consistent across the entire data range. Don't love it, but they did a bunch of work. Like, it's certainly in a better position than it was when they opened up the file. Another person didn't do any charts. Oh, hang on. Yes, they did. They did a breakdown of outputs. It's a chart in its own worksheet, which I do quite like. They did a pie chart. Simple chart and simple data. I think the blue is too much in terms of visual formatting. I think it makes, the more values you've got, the more difficult it is to read. I don't love all of the internal cells are all accounting. First row and last row, I would personally format as accounting, but everything else I would format as comma style, like this, because it's identical to accounting in terms of like alignment and decimal places. It just removes the dollar symbol from the left-hand side of that cell. And I think this looks cleaner and it's easier to read. The blue really doesn't help. The alternating, like, banded rows is good, it's fine, but the blue that it's filling it with is a little bit too dark for me. It's not really pleasant to look at. But they've done the same thing, right? It looks like they've repeated the header row. They've used tables. They've turned off the drop down filter. They've merged across the headings. This is one giant cell in each of these. They've used the total row. Not as careful, not as considered. There's a whole bunch of changes that I would make to this worksheet, but this is what somebody else did. It's not the worst thing ever. Someone did this, which looks closer, I guess, to the first example. They've got more charts. Again, I turn off the filters, the filter buttons from being displayed in the charts. I think it looks cleaner. If you're not going to use them, then there's no reason for them to be taking up space visually in the worksheet. They did something different with their headings, and they've also used hyperlinks for these headings. So these are actually buttons which will select the range of data like this. So I quite like that. I don't hate it. I don't know how you would use this. I'd use this across worksheets. I don't know whether I would use it in the same worksheet. But they get marks for it. Like it's not useless. If you can do it in Excel, someone's going to find a reason to use it, a way to leverage it. And so I don't hate it. Quite like it. I do think it makes the data a little bit more difficult to read. I would have liked, I think, the headings above the tables to separate each range of data from the next. But it's good. It's good for the assignment. See, what I would do in reality, and what I would do for an assignment like this might not necessarily be the exact same thing. In the assignment, you kind of want it to be a little bit flashy. You've got to pick up some marks. You've got to leverage all the functions that are listed in the rubric somewhere, somehow. And the more of them that you use and the more complex you make it, the more marks you're going to get. That doesn't necessarily mean that it really makes sense to do that in real life with this data. The goal is to take the data and make it valuable, pull some answers out of it, and make it more easily digestible. A lot of that is to do with the visual presentation, and then once you've done that piece, you kind of pivot and then you go after the functionality. How can I take the values that I've got and make them more valuable? What kind of data can I get to? Don't love the outputs chart. Don't love pie chart without a title. That tells me very little. Means I've got to look at the legend to figure out what this is. Column chart, stacked column chart. Don't love the charts. I don't think these are very good charts at all. But the range of data is formatted in a fairly clean fashion. We'll look at one more. This is not the first worksheet. This is the first worksheet. Nice and simple. It's got its overall title up here, which I don't think is necessary, but you can do it. Fixed cost range that's formatted as a table, but very differently to the other ranges. This data is really quite easy to read. I still think comma style is a better bet for internal monetary values. Does it even need to be? I mean, we do have some decimal answers, so they're not all whole numbers. So I can't even reduce the number of decimal places. It wouldn't really make sense because then you're going to get rounded up numbers or rounded down numbers. It is what it is. It's a minor thing. It's not really a big deal, but I would approach it a slightly different way. Do they have anything else in here? No, they don't. There's no charts for this data, which is fine. You don't need charts, but you do need to use charts somewhere in the file. And then this one is the last one that we'll look at. And what do we got here? Dashboard quarterly sales. They've got a lot of worksheets, so they've introduced a whole bunch of new data, it looks like. Quite like the way this is formatted, except that they use Comic Sans, which is a font that I absolutely despise. This was one of the worst fonts that was ever created. It's horrible. You'd use it for a birthday card or an invitation or something. You wouldn't use it for this, or at least I would never use it for this. It feels very incongruent with the data. But it is what it is. It's a font, and they changed the font, so I'll give them marks for it. This, I suspect, I hope, is the last column. No, it's not. They formatted it manually. Fine. And then you'll see that the date headings, January through December, is not repeated at the top of each one of these ranges, which is different from all of the other submissions. And arguably, this is how I would have done it. I don't know that it needs to be repeated. I think you introduce too much, things start to look really busy and cluttered. This is clean. I don't hate it, but again, no charts. And I don't think, because this is different data, I don't even think any of this dashboard stuff. This is for a different worksheet, so there's no charts to go with this first worksheet, which is fine. Interestingly, it does look like they've selected the values in the total row, and then not only used the total row in the table tool options, which will give that last row some formatting. You'll see that if I zoom in, there's like a double border. It's really thin in the row above the total row, and then there's like a single border at the bottom of that cell. But then the values are also using what looks to me to be, we just select these cells that contain this formatting. I think they came into here and used this double accounting underline. And the question is, why is it not actually turned on? I enabled it there, and you see it looks exactly the same. This double line under the values, this is an accounting underline. You can't get to it from the regular underline tool, although it says double underline is turned on here. They've used this one, double accounting, because there's single, double, single accounting, and double accounting, and they all look slightly different. This looks like double accounting to me. Oh, what's this? They do have a chart. Eyes. Oh, they've got two charts. Yeah, okay. So I don't like this at all. They shouldn't have used the total data in the chart. That doesn't help them whatsoever, because all it does is it skews and makes the monthly values really difficult to read. This worksheet is locked, so I can't interact with this. And so I can't clear the totals out and deselect them. If you did, then the bars would extend up higher, and you would get something that looks a lot cleaner and that's more appropriate. But they didn't. They've included the totals, which you should never do unless you're comparing one set of totals against another set of totals. You should never compare totals to the values that make the total. It doesn't make any sense. And then this pie chart is awful. It's too small, can't read it. Oh, you can, but it's not good. This is not tidy. If this was bigger on its own worksheet, it would look better. This small in this worksheet, it really doesn't work. But they did use charts, so they picked up some marks for charts, presumably. So the way that I would approach this first worksheet, you've got to fix the formatting first before you can use any additional functionality. And so I think what I would do is there's a couple of things that we need to target. One, I want to get rid of this horrible grid that's applied to this range of cells because it looks really ugly. I don't want it there at all. So I want to get rid of the grid. I want to make the columns wide enough so that the values can be read clearly. And I also want to adjust, I think, the row height because the row height is too big. The columns are too narrow, but the row height is too big. So I'm going to auto fit row height, auto fit column width. And then I'm going to take it'll wipe out. No, it won't. Because then I need to adjust the fractions and make them regular numbers. So I think we can do this in 3 steps. The first step would be, I would select everything in this worksheet. So where the rows and the columns meet in the corner right here, When you click this button, it'll select everything in that worksheet, just this worksheet. And I think I would clear the formatting in this first worksheet. So in the Home tab, in the editing group, there's a button that's called Clear, and it's a drop-down menu. And if you expand the drop-down menu, you get a couple of different options. You get Clear All, Clear Formats, and Clear Contents. Now, I don't want to delete the actual data in the cells, so I don't want to clear all, and I don't want to clear contents. I want to leave the data in the cells, and I want to strip the formatting from this worksheet and set it back to the default formatting. So if I click Clear Formats, it's going to wipe out the fractions and set the numbers back to general or number, and it's going to get rid of that grid. What it won't do is fix the column widths and the row heights. So step one is going to be clear the formats like this. All right, that gives us numbers we can use now. Are they general? Yeah, they're general. So we'll format the values as a counting and comma style manually. We've got rid of the fractions. We've got rid of that ugly grid. So that's step one. And then I would auto fit column width and auto fit row height. Now, if you're in select all like this, you should then just be able to go between two columns and double click to auto fit column width. But if you want to use the ribbon to do this, with all of this selected, you could come to the cells group in the Home tab, come into the format drop down, and then auto fit column width is here. Auto fit row height is also here. But again, you can click this button, or you can select everything and then double click between two rows, and it'll do the same thing. And so it's going to size the column width to the largest value in that column, so that everything could be displayed on a single line. So product development is the longest text string in column 8. So the column width becomes wide enough to accommodate that text string in one row, because we're not using text wrapping. And then all the others look like they're being dictated by the months. The text month is what's dictating the width of the remaining columns. So this looks like data I can now work with. So that was an easy fix. So I think what I would do is probably turn this stuff into tables. Before I do, I think I'm going to populate column N with calculations to give me the totals for each of these rows. So I'm going to select this range, and then hold Control and select this range. And then we could probably also do the first 3 rows here, because those would also need totals. Doesn't really make the profit total. Yeah, profit total, first 4 rows. The last row, percent profit, doesn't really make sense to include as a total. It's going to add up to more than 100%. So that's not a valuable answer to us. So I think I would make this selection. And bear in mind, the goal of this is not to copy what I'm doing. There are some steps that you would take that I've taken, but your submission should look different to mine. I'm not giving you the answer here. What you have is a range of options. You've got some choices available to you. And I think I would go to the Home tab and then say, I would like to auto sum that range, please. You'll see that it inserted values down here. Did it put some functions in? No, it didn't. Maybe we'll do that last range at the end, because there are no values in here. It hasn't totaled them, and it didn't put the actual sums in. And then this one presumably just needs to be a bit wider. And so we'll total the fixed costs, fixed cost total, variable cost total. We'll do this later when we've calculated these values. So we'll do this in a few minutes when I've done the calculations. But column N contains my totals. And fixed cost total down here in row 24 is January's fixed cost total. And so I would say equals sum, open parentheses, and then I would give it this range of data, B4 to B10, like this. I'd leave the cell references relative, so that this range, when we copy the formula in B24 across in that row to C24, the range that I've selected in B4 to B10 also moves, and it's going to become C4 to C10, so that I get an appropriate calculation. So I can copy that all the way across like this, and then we'll do the same for the variable costs. So equal sum open parentheses, these values, B15 to B18 in my worksheet, like this. Copy this all the way across. And then the profit amount, I would say, is equal to the revenue from B23 in my worksheet minus the sum of B24 and B25. That leaves you with the profit amount. These are not real numbers, by the way. Don't get too worked up about the fact that if this was a real business, they'd go bankrupt very quickly, because these are not very realistic profit numbers at all. If this was a side business, maybe, but even for a month, $282, it's not a lot of money, especially if you're paying rent and you've got a whole bunch of outgoings. So don't worry about the numbers; they're just representative of values for these types of costs. We don't really care what the numbers are. It's not our business. That's the profit amounts, and then the percent profit I would calculate by saying take the profit amount and then divide the profit amount by the revenue, and that would give you decimal answers that represent percentages that I would then convert to percentages with 2 decimal places. I think it makes sense to do 2 decimal places, otherwise you get numbers that round up and round down. All right, I don't think it makes sense to populate this last cell with a total, so I'm going to leave it empty. Which means that if I call this categories, you can introduce data to the workbook. You can add things, you can remove things. But if you're going to remove something, you need a really good reason for it. Or you can create new data. You create new data, you're going to get more marks for it, because it requires you to do more work. So I'll turn these into tables, and then we'll format the headings, I think. Just trying to think about anything else I want to do. No, I think we're good. I think we're good. I haven't decided whether I'm going to use the total rows for each range or not, because technically the data's down here. We know what the totals are that would go in these ranges if these were total rows. I might still include them though, because it allows me to use the total row option in the tables more than once, which allows me to bank a whole bunch of marks from the rubric just in this first worksheet. So I think what we'll do is we'll start with the first range. You could make all of this one range, one big table, but I'm not going to recommend it. I think that the way to approach this is probably 3 separate tables, or just not to have it into tables and to make manual edits to turn it into data that looks more presentable. Doesn't necessarily need to be in a table to do that. This first range does have a row that I want to be headers. So it can see that there's something in the first row, and it says my table has headers right here. It's checked already, so I'm going to click OK. And then I think we'll pick a different style. In fact, we'll manipulate the options first. If I turn the total row on and then ask it for, it doesn't have to be sum, but let's do sum, because it seems like the obvious thing to do. in that first range. I don't adore the formatting. I'm trying to think. So you don't want it to look too garish. Like that. That's horrible. And that. And that. Why are these even possibilities? This is awful. I'm looking for something that's really easy on the eyes. Something that's easy to read. I think, honestly, I would go with just grey and white banded rows. Because I think it looks a lot cleaner. And we could pick one of these and turn banded rows on. Like one of these styles where banded rows is turned off. We could also use banded columns. Because we're reading this down, right? I mean, we are reading it across, but it's monthly data across all three ranges. So maybe I don't even want banded rows. Banded rows is turned on by default. Maybe I don't want banded rows. Maybe what I want is banded columns instead. I actually think that looks worse. What options do we have? What does it give us? It's not the worst way to look at the data. I don't hate it. And it depends how you're reading the data. It depends whether we're really interested in the values by month or whether we're interested in each individual category and reading like separate to one another and then reading rows. Yeah, some of this is really ugly. Maybe I would use banded rows. What you wouldn't do is use them both. You can, but you shouldn't, because if you do, it does this, which doesn't mean anything to anybody. That's horrible. So either banded rows or banded columns, or neither. But what you wouldn't do is use them both together. I'm feeling a little bit indecisive, I think. Because it's different, I'm going to go with banded columns. I don't know if this is the decision I would make. It probably isn't. But I'm going to leave it on because it is valid. If we're reading this by month, then banded rows helps us do that. So let's pick something that isn't disgusting. I'm going to go green, I think, which I don't love, but it looks fine. It's easy enough on the eyes. And then I'm just going to leave it like this. In that first table, I probably want to use first column to bold the category values. You don't have to, but I think I'm going to. And then last column will bold the total amounts in column N. We've got the total row turned on as well. And then perhaps we'll do what one of the students did and then go in and is that the same color? No, it's not. Is that the same color? No, it's not. Trying to figure out what color they used. Up here. It must be part of this theme. That feels like it's too dark. That feels like it's too light. And then that's too dark. Is that that's not the same color? Maybe it's actually a different color. I think it's a different color. Okay. Now, I don't want to change the theme at this point. You're going to have to do that anyway. So you could figure out what color you want it to be. I want to pick something that stands out. That's disgusting. Those are all bold anyway. I'll come back to that. I'm going to leave it for now. I'm not really sure what I want to do with the total row. I don't like it like this. I want to give it something to make it stand out. Doesn't have to be the exact same color. Purple's disgusting. Purple's actually my favorite color, but not for this. Red is awful. Dark red is awful. Honestly, with the green, I think we're going to end up with something like this. I'm just going to go with that for now. It's not the most attractive thing I've ever seen, but it's fine. And then what I would do is I would select the first and last row, and I would make those accounting, 2 decimal places. You're going to have to keep making minor adjustments. As soon as you start adding things to cells and making them wider and putting more content in them, you're going to have to keep adjusting column width. But it is what it is. And then I think I would take the internal monetary values and make them comma style, like this. I'd take the total here, I'd indent it twice, like that. And then this last row, I don't think I would do the double accounting, because if you're using table formatting, it brings its own formatting for the total row. But what I might do is insert a bottom double border to that range, like that, just to cap it off. I'm supposed to be demonstrating here options that you've got, and I don't even like my own work, but it's fine. It's fine. I'm going to do the same thing. Unfortunately, you can't copy the style from one table to another in a very easy fashion. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and repeat the same steps as quick as I can. You'll see that when I make the second selection, I'm not selecting all of the data anyway. I'm not actually making a selection of data. I'm clicking within a range of data, and I'm telling Excel, I want a table. And what Excel does is it looks at what's in adjacent cells, and then it makes a selection for me. It actually selects outwards until it hits blank rows and blank columns. So you don't actually need to make a direct selection of the data when you do this. But you'll see that because all the values are consistent in each of these columns, in each of the rows, except the first column, in each of the rows and each of the columns, it can't identify whether there's a row that should be headers. When it did the selection for the first range, there were values in the first row that were different from the other rows underneath. So it identified that first row as header row. We don't have that here, so it hasn't pre-checked my table as headers for me. When I click OK, it's going to turn it into a table, but all tables have to have a header row so that you can sort and filter. And so what's actually going to happen is it's going to insert a new row above with preset column labels. And it'll say column 1, column 2, column 3, column 4, column 5, and so on all the way across. I'm going to let that happen. And then if you come here and turn off the header row, it hides it. And so I'm going to turn the header off. I can't remember now what options I used. I used banded columns. I used total row. I used last column. I used first column. Those are the options I used in the table. And then I picked something. That looks the same. I think it was light green table style medium 7. We don't get the dark green for the header row because we don't have one. And then the total row, I'll do the same thing and calculate the sum all the way across. We'll indent twice the total heading in the total row. We might even come back and make these italic just to further mess with it. And then I'll fill that range the same. I'll do the same for the last range. Again, no headers. So it inserts them. We'll turn them off. Total row, last column, first column, banded columns instead of banded rows. This one, get it to do the total calculation, indent this twice. Doesn't have to be twice, it's just something that I do. And then we'll select that row, we'll fill it with some formatting. And then what I think we'll do is we'll get rid of these blank rows that currently don't contain anything, and we will take our headings like this, merge and center them, and then I'll use a cell style and make them heading 1 style, maybe like this. And I think no, I thought for a second maybe that's what I would do. Maybe I would fill that cell, but I'm not going to fill it with that color. I would pick something different. But for now, I'm going to leave it like this. What's going on over here? We've got inconsistent calculated formulas. Equals sum B14, which is this, to M14. Why is it inconsistent? It's not inconsistent. It's fine. Ignore these errors. Those are fine. B14 to M16. Yeah, no, those are okay. Sometimes that will happen. Like if you're working with a range of data, sometimes you'll get those little green triangles. Let me go back like this in the top left-hand corner. And if you click on a cell, there's a drop-down menu, and it says Excel has spotted something that it thinks might be a problem. It's not always right. In this case, it's wrong. It's actually fine, but it tries to help. First row, last row, first row. I'm going to turn the total row off, actually, in this last range, because it doesn't make sense. And then I'll probably do profit values like this. Those are accounting. Everything else I'll set to comma style. This last table, I'm actually going to turn off the total row because it doesn't really make sense. And then we'll do auto fit column widths again so that everything fits. I'm going to fill this cell blank black. It's not being used, and it looks ugly, but it doesn't make sense to have a value in here. And see now that I've done that, I don't know if I like this fill color. I was hesitant in the first place. I was hesitant in the first place, but yeah, I don't love it, and I don't know whether I want to fill it with any color at all. Actually, might just leave it like this. I'll tell you what I'll do. Let's fill it light gray. When in doubt, when it comes to colors, light gray will work. Like that. I think maybe this row and this row also make italic. Maybe this range, this range, this range, also italic. There are cell styles for total values and output values, but I don't know if I'd use them here. I would equalize the amount of space between each of the ranges like this. And then perhaps, maybe, would I turn off the grid lines in the worksheet? Yeah, I think so. But turn off the grid lines, you see that you don't see the outline of the cells in the worksheet, so then everything looks a lot clearer, like it stands out more. That looks better. It's not perfect, but it looks better than it did, and that's the goal. And so at a minimum, I would do something like this with that range. Now, what you actually do with it is completely up to you. It doesn't have to be three separate tables. You could combine all of the values into a single table if you think you can make it work. But be careful. You've got to apply number formatting to the values in this worksheet. You've got to apply some visual formatting to the data in this worksheet. You need to perform some calculations in this worksheet down here. All of this stuff is based on calculations. And this is new data, right? This didn't exist in the file that we opened up. And then hopefully you have some level of consistent formatting. I think I would take this last row and even this last row and also do the double bottom border. And I think I'm effectively done with this worksheet. Everyone did charts in this first worksheet, which is fine, and you can do that. But I don't know that I would. You've got to think about what data you're going to use. You know, if you include rent as a value in your chart, well, it's the same value every month. So it's just going to be consistent across 12 months. There's no variation for a chart to really point out. There is some variation in some of these, right? Like overhead costs change by month, which technically I suppose makes them not a fixed cost. But there's not a lot of variation. Like it's not really going to give you a very interesting looking chart at all. It's not a straight line, but it's close to a straight line. So you've got to find values that are gonna work. Like even the total values, they're not inconsistent enough. They're too close together for it to really to really produce an interesting looking chart. So I don't know that I would do that. Unfortunately, because we have time-based data, which is always really good for certain charts. Line charts, for example, are very good with time-based data over time. But I don't know whether I would. I don't know whether I would bother with this first worksheet. We've got 5 other worksheets where we can introduce charts, and some of the data in those other worksheets is arguably better for using for displaying visually. But I don't know. Percent profit doesn't really change. Profit amounts, there's some variability, but again, it's not a lot. Sales don't really change much, which is why the charts that people got weren't particularly interesting. I think I'd leave it alone in this first worksheet. You can include charts if you can think of something that's going to work really well in a chart, then by all means go ahead. But just bear in mind that if the values are really close together, your chart's not going to show anything interesting. Sales bonuses has quite a lot of variation for small numbers. We go from 32 to 52. So that's 20 that it differs by. $20, presumably. So maybe. But do with it what you think. At a minimum, you want something that looks much more readable than the data that we started out with. And so this achieves that. The financial services worksheet is the second worksheet that I'm going to actually demonstrate something with, and then the rest of them I'll very briefly talk about the data in the worksheets and some of the options that you've got, but I'm not actually going to demonstrate it because everyone should have a different answer. Everyone should have a different answer to me. It's not, you shouldn't have exactly what I have. That's not the goal of this assessment. In the second worksheet, this is the only other worksheet where like a major amendment to the way that the data is arranged has to be made. And so what we've got is in column A, in A1 we've got a title, and then in A2 we've got a combined text value in a single cell that is supposed to be column headings. So we've got date, employee, category, amount, whether the expense is taxable or not, and then whether the expense is being offloaded to the client, whether the client's going to be responsible for paying that expense, or whether we are going to pay it. And you'll see in that row that each of these things that is representative of a column heading is separated from the next one by a comma. And so this is what's called a delimiter. Now, we did this in Word, where we took a combined range of text like this, and then told Microsoft Word, I want you to break that data across multiple columns. And I want you to break it where, and it gave us options. There was like paragraph, comma, tab, and then there was a box where you could enter like a custom symbol. And I think what we did in the LinkedIn Learning final prep file, the final challenge exercise, was colon. I think we inserted the colon to say split the data. Every time you encounter a colon, split it into a new column. And so we're effectively going to do the exact same thing here, but we're going to turn this data into, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns of data. And we're going to ask it to split the values into each new column when it encounters the comma. So we'll have a date column that only contains dates. And then when it encounters the comma, it'll separate into a column B and it'll say employee. And then we'll have the employee names. And then it encounters another column, another comma, and it'll split into column C, where it'll include the categories and so on. So what we're going to do is we're going to select this range of data for cell A1 all the way down to A32. We're going to go to the data tab with this range selected. And in the data tools group, there's a button that says use text to columns. So split a single column of text into multiple columns. For example, you can separate a column full of names into separate first and last name columns, and you can choose how to split it up. You can either use fixed width, like number of characters, or you can split at each comma, period, or any other character. Not the best description, but it works in a very, very similar fashion to Word. And so we have delimited data. The delimiter in our data is the comma. All delimiter means is how are the values separated from one another in that record. And so it says, if it's delimited data, characters such as commas or tabs separate each field. And it means from the next field. So at the bottom, we've got a preview here. This is what it currently looks like. It is delimited, but when we click next, oh, actually, it's done a pretty good job. It might have tabs selected and not comma. And if it does, it won't look any different because there are no tabs in these records. So it can't do anything with them if it can't find them. So it's not tab delimited, but that's usually the default. What we want is to separate the columns by commas where it encounters the commas. So as soon as we deselect tab and then select comma, you'll see that we get a preview where we've got a date column, an employee column, a category column, an amount column, a taxable column, and then an expense to client column. And that looks fine. This looks good. So as long as your preview, as soon as your preview looks the way that you want the data, you can just click finish. You don't need to click next. And it'll do this. That first column's way too big, but it's still the same width that it was when all of the values were combined into column A. And so what we can do is just auto fit the column width again, just to correct that. And then we've got some data that we can actually work with. I'm not the biggest fan of Well, I said, okay, so what would we do? At most, maybe we would merge the heading, maybe, because then we can auto fit column width again and make the date column a more appropriate size. Um, I wouldn't turn this into a regular table, especially because we've just used tables in the accounting worksheet. What a lot of students do is they take every single range of data in the file and they turn it into a table. And I don't know why. Because you can still perform calculations and sort and filter and all that kind of stuff with regular ranges of data. You don't need to turn everything into a table. That's not what Excel is really for. But some students they look at the data and they go, okay, columns and rows, that's a table. No, it's tabular data, but it doesn't mean that you need to format it as a table. Like, yeah, it's records of data that are split into rows and columns, but it doesn't, if you're not going to use any of the table options, then what's the point? The only advantage that you get is that it gives you some visual formatting. Um, but if you use tables, it limits the visual formats that you can apply to it. Otherwise, you're gonna have to go in and make a bunch of manual corrections. And at that point, what's the point? What's the point of using the table function? So I don't know that I would turn this into a table, or at least not a regular table. I would do one of two things with this range of data. I would either turn it into subtotal data, because if we look at the data that we've got, I'm just going to separate the header from the range of data here. We've got dates, and they're all in 2024. They're all in April 2024. We've got employee names, and some of the employee names are listed multiple times. So this is Jane Smith, this is Jane Smith, this is Jane Smith. I think each of these people repeats 3 times. It's not my data. I didn't create it. And that doesn't mean that these are duplicate records. The amounts are different. The category of expense that they submitted is different. And then the date is different. So there isn't necessarily duplicate records here, despite the fact that some things appear to repeat at first glance. We should check it by going to the data tab, clicking within the range of data. You don't need to actually select all of it. And in the data tools group where the text to columns function was, there is also a remove duplicates button. And when you click it, it says, all right, what columns are we checking? And it's going to look to see whether it finds any records where it has the exact same value in each of these columns. If we deselected them all and just said employee, it would find a bunch of duplicates. But the same employee can submit different expenses, different amounts on different dates, and that's not a duplicate record. And so I'm going to leave them all selected. Click OK. It says no duplicate values found. So this is good. The data is relatively clean. Or at least it's clean of duplicate records. There's no other mistakes in here. You could sort it by date. You could sort it by employee. You could sort it by category. You could filter by employee, filter by category. If you were going to turn this into a regular table, those are the kind of tools that you would probably want to use. And so with that in mind, I wouldn't use tables because it takes too long. I'll show you. If I said I want to turn this into a table and wait, hang on. Nope. Because we do have headers. We do have headers. There we go. Then it's like maybe I would want to see all of Jane Smith's expenses, right? That might be an answer that somebody wants. So whoever's working with these expense reports, maybe we want to see just Jane Smith's records. So you would turn it into a table, you would drop down filter, and then you would filter to just Jane Smith, right? Okay, fine. But that means I can't see any of the other data now. So if I wanted to compare Jane Smith with, say, Bob Brown, I need to then go and select Bob Brown's data and add it here. And then I need to probably sort by employee so that I can see all of Jane Smith's togethers, all of Bob Brown's togethers. Second level sort maybe by category. I don't I don't like working like this. If I can't see all of the records or access all of the data, then I'm not usually that interested. Tables are fine for narrowing down the scope of the data that you want to look at. So I can restrict the data to specific employees or specific dates or specific categories. But it's going to hide a bunch of rows to display that data, and I don't love that. There's another feature in Excel that's arguably more restrictive than even regular tables. But with this particular data, the subtotal function that I'm going to show you would work quite nicely because it would allow us to do maybe a two-level sort, either by category and then by employee, or by employee and then by category, I think is the way to go. Employees. So at the top, we're going to get all of Andrew Thompson's records together. And then it will show us broken down alphabetically by category, what expenses he submitted, and then underneath it would show Alice Johnson's all together. And then we can add a subtotal to the amount column by employee. So we can see the total amount submitted by each employee. Now we can't do that with the data with this arrangement. What we're going to have to do, if I want to use the subtotal function, I'm going to need to sort the data, and I need to sort the data by the column that I want to organize the records by. So we're going to organize them by employee. I want all of the A's first, then the B's, then the C's, then the D's, and so on. So we'll put these in alphabetical order, and then I'll apply the subtotal function. We're going to ignore category for a second. The data will be included in the records, but I don't know that it really needs to be in a particular order. So we'll do a one-level sort first. So I don't need to turn this into a table to sort it. If I have one cell selected within the range, I can go to the data tab. I can come to the sort and filter group in the ribbon, and I can go into the sort tool and ask it to sort the data alphabetically A to Z by employee, like that. So I get all of Alice Johnson's records, then I get Andrew Thompson's records, Bob Brown's records, David Kim's records, Emily Lee's records, Emma Wilson's records, and so on. So they're grouped now, which means that, let's say I wasn't going to use the subtotal function, but I wanted to achieve the same answer. If I wanted to know what the total amount of expenses was submitted by each individual employee, I would need to sort the data like this by employee, and then I could insert a blank row under the Alice Johnson records, and then I could use the auto sum function to calculate the total amount of expenses that Alice Johnson submitted. I could do the same for Andrew Thompson. I could insert a row where it changes from Andrew Thompson to Bob Brown, and then I could auto sum Andrew Thompson's expenses to get a total amount. And it does, I don't need to turn it into a table, and I don't need to use the subtotal function to achieve that. I can do that manually, but it's more work. Provided that the data is sorted by one of these categories. And so in this case, by employee. If I go to the data tab, there's a group called outline. And in that group, there's a function called subtotal. If I open up the subtotal function, it gives me some options. And so what we have is, it says at each change in, and it means every time the value in whichever column changes, apply whatever calculation to the data in whichever column. And so we just sorted by employee. So what we're going to do is we're going to say to Excel, when you read down the employee column, every time the employee value changes, so it goes Alice Johnson, Alice Johnson, Alice Johnson, those are all the same, then it changes. And it changes to Andrew Thompson. So every time the value in the employee column changes to a different value, so to a different person, use the sum function to sum the values for that employee from the amount column. And this is effectively going to give us the same thing that I was just doing manually. So it's going to go 1, 2, 3. Those are Alice Johnson's records. Now it changes. Insert a blank row after Alice Johnson's records, and then use the sum function to sum the values from Alice Johnson's expenses and provide me a total. That's what this is going to do. Click OK. And so that's what we get. So it looks like this. It's a little bit ugly, but it's completely functional. We get Alice Johnson's records, then we get Alice Johnson's total. We get Andrew Thompson's records, then we get Andrew Thompson's total. We get Bob Brown's records, then we get Bob Brown's total, and so on. So we get totals for all of these people. Now, this view looks messy, but you'll see that we got this really weird like framework on the left-hand side, where you've got buttons that can be expanded and collapsed, and then you get the numbers 1, 2, and 3 at the top. These buttons at the top are the only ones that I would normally interact with. Button number 3 is all of the data and the totals, including the grand total at the very end that it's inserted. Button number 2 is the one that, in this particular example, it's the answer I think where most people will be looking for, or something similar. It reduces the data so that we don't see the actual records themselves, we just see the totals and the grand total. So I can compare from here now Alice Johnson's submitted expenses against Karen Miller's submitted expenses. I can see them next to each other, which you wouldn't be able to do in a regular table. I mean, you can, but it's a lot of work to get there. This is far simpler. And then if you press button number 1, it just gives you the grand total like this, which maybe is an answer that you care about, but I think most people would want to see this data. So you could leave the worksheet like this. This is, some work has been done. You've applied a function, some functionality to the data to make it more useful, to make this is valuable to somebody to see employee expenses at this level. And if you wanted to like view the totals and then expand, say, Alice Johnson's, then you can collapse it to bottom number 2 that just shows you the subtotals of the grand total, and then you can expand Alice Johnson's records on their own, and maybe Jane Smith's, and compare them that way. So it's restrictive because you can't do an awful lot more than this with subtotals, but it's useful. We could have done a second level sort by category, but I think that's overcomplicating this particular data. I don't think we necessarily need anything other than one answer like this. If you don't like it, fine, that's okay. I'll remove it. I'll get rid of it by going back into the subtotal function and clicking on the button that says remove all, like that. That will give me back my original range of data that I sorted by employee. Subtotals isn't the only option that you've got in this worksheet. You could also turn it into a pivot table. And so in the Insert tab, same place that you get regular tables, there's also pivot tables. So if I say, give me a pivot table, Excel makes an appropriate selection of data. And then it says, where do you want the pivot table? So I am going to put it on a new worksheet and click OK. And this is what it gives us. You get this weird kind of report pane on the left-hand side, which is where the pivot table will be constructed. But the pivot table doesn't know what data you want to use yet. And so you have to use this pivot table field pane on the right-hand side of this worksheet. in order to add data to this pivot table report that you're now constructing. And you don't necessarily want all of the data that was used to generate the pivot table. We probably want employee and category, an amount, and date. But I don't think we want taxable and expense to client. We didn't use any of that data. We weren't interested in any of that data when we did the subtotals function. So if we want something that looks a little bit like the subtotal answer that we just got, where we could see the amounts that were submitted by category by employee, then those are the only fields that we need to use. And you can treat these two ways. You can either check the box to turn them on and let Excel figure out how to arrange the data, or you can do it manually. And that's sometimes a good thing, sometimes a bad thing. If I just turn these fields on, if I say add the employee data to the pivot table, if I check this box, Excel has put it in the rows area of the pivot table field pane. And so then it looks like this. All of the employees, they're in the same column, but the values are all in different rows. So those are my people. And you'll see that it's ordered. And then if I insert the amounts, those are the amounts that were submitted by each employee. If you don't need a breakdown of the category, then this is the exact same answer that we got from the subtotal function. This is the total amount of expenses submitted across multiple categories by Alice Johnson. If you want the category data too, then we can turn it on, and the order that you add the fields in dictates the order that they are displayed in the field pane, which and right now we're looking at employees first and then categories underneath. And so you get Alice Johnson's expenses broken out. You get the total. This is the summed value. And that's the sum of her accommodation and her meals expenses. So it sums these two, gives you the total. The total goes above and not below, but it's the same data that we got in the subtotal function. And then we get Andrew Thompson's and Bob Brown's. But if you wanted to see categories first and not employee first, so like accommodation and then all of the employees that submitted accommodation expenses, and it won't be everybody, then all you would need to do is change the order that these are in. And you can do that in the drop-down menu. There's an option to move up or move to beginning, or you can literally click and drag above the employee field and then let go. It will change the arrangement of the data so that we then get the accommodation, the category type, and then a list of the employees that submitted that type of expense and the amount, which I think is probably more appropriate. And so this is a pivot table. Now, if you wanted to restrict the data that you're looking at to specific employees, in a regular table, you would need to use the drop-down filters in the column headings, and then it would only show you the data that you're asking for. With pivot tables, you've actually got multiple options. If you have a drop-down filter, so we've got one here for our row labels, the different categories, then you can use it just like a regular table. But we don't have that for employees here. You would have to switch employee back to the main category in order to then, in fact, it's still not going to allow us to do it. You'd need a slightly different arrangement of data to do this. But we have other options. I'm going to set that back. I want category to be first because I think it looks better. What we could do is you could move employee to the filters area of the report pane. It's going to remove the employee data from the pivot table itself. So now I just see the summed values for the expense categories, but not by employee. But if I wanted to see Alice Johnson's expenses on their own, if I wanted just to filter to her, then I could, because I add employee to the filters area, it puts a drop-down filter in row number 1. And I can come in here and I can say just Alice Johnson, and then I can see just her expenses. One of the problems that I've got with this, because this is fine, it gets you a really nice quick answer. It's easy to use. But one of the problems that I've got with it is as soon as you select, say, 2 people, because right now you can see it says Alice Johnson's expenses are being displayed. As soon as I select more than 1, it says multiple. So then you don't know what the data is representative of unless you click the drop-down menu and go and look. Now I can see, okay, so this is Alice Johnson's and Jane Smith's. But right here I can't. So I don't love using this type of filter in pivot tables. Sometimes it's just the easiest way, but I would actually handle this a different way. So I'm going to put employee back into the data like this. So I've got the breakdown by category and then by employee within the category. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the pivot table analyze tab. And you need to have the pivot table. You need to have your insertion point somewhere within the pivot table for the pivot table tabs to display. If you don't have a cell selected inside the pivot table, they'll disappear. The pivot table field pane on the right-hand side will disappear as well. So if you reselect it, it will reappear, and so will the tabs. In the pivot table analyze tab, there's a group called filter. And there's a button called insert slicer. And slicers can be used with regular tables too, but I think they're far more useful in pivot tables. And so if I click insert slicer, it gives me a list of all of the fields. So whatever the column headings were in the original source data are the fields that I can pick from. These are the same fields that are displayed in the pivot table fields area. All of the data from our original source that we used to generate the pivot table from has been rolled up just into its heading. And so if you want to access the data, you need to include the heading in the pivot table. But you do the same thing with filters. If I want to filter by employee, I can click OK. And then I can bring my slicer up here. You can see that I turned on snap to grid. So it snaps to cells. Normally, it's better on resizing. You can fit it to an exact range of cells if you want. And I've got a scrollable list of all the employees. So if I want to see Alice Johnson's records, I can say, all right, show me Alice Johnson's records. I quite like this breakdown because it gives me the amounts, the total amount, and then it gives me the individual amounts per category. And if I wanted to see Bob Brown's, I could click on Bob Brown. If I wanted to see Emma Wilson's, I could click on Emma Wilson. If I wanted to see multiple employees, you can either hold Control and click another record, or like click a couple of records. I'm still holding Control. And then as soon as you let go of Control, the pivot table will be updated to include that data. Or you don't have to use Control at all. There's a button here that says multi-select. If you turn it on, then you can just turn them on and off, but it'll let you select multiple. If this isn't turned on by default, then just clicking is going to filter to one value. So if you want to see multiple, that's probably the best way to do it. So like an employee slicer, or maybe a category slicer, or whether the expense is being pushed back to the client. You could insert as a slicer. You've got different options, and then with the slicer selected, it gets its own context sensitive tab, so you can change the colors, and you can also change the height of the tool and what the buttons look like. So if I don't want a scrollable list necessarily. I don't necessarily want to make this a big slicer. Like this is fine, but if it was bigger than this, I wouldn't really want a scrollable list. And so what I would normally do is I would say, well, give me 2 or 3 columns instead. And then I'd make the pivot table wider to accommodate for the names so that I get a nice small-ish tool to work with alongside my data, and I can see the values that I've got selected, which is the main reason that I think working like this provides an advantage over using the pivot table filter area. You can have the data in the worksheet being displayed and filter it, and you can see what filters are applied visually without having to go into a drop-down menu to see what data is being displayed if you've got multiple selected. So I would do it this way. I'd probably approach it this way. And I'd either do subtotal data in this worksheet, or I would build a pivot table, something like this. What it does, I got it to put it in the new worksheet, so it leaves the original source data untouched. Any manipulation that you make to the pivot table isn't going to affect the original source data. And so at this point, I'd probably rename this pivot table worksheet as financial services and then hide the source data or do something different with it. Now, what other students did for the financial services worksheet is what we'll look at. And so this is a regular table and a pivot table. This is a regular table. So they put the pivot table in the same worksheet. They took their original source data, put it into a regular table. They use some count functions and comments. So they're banking a whole bunch of marks here. This is a note. These are comments. You're expected to use both. And they went to the formula tab and turned on show formulas for these cells or in this worksheet. And so you can see this is subtotal data. This is using count A, and the unique function. This is nested. I wouldn't do that. And then they did the same thing here. In fact, I might do that in this particular worksheet. That's quite clever, to be honest, because we've got a lot of duplicate values because the same people submitted different types of expenses on different days. Then this gives me just the unique values from that column. So one count of Alice Johnson only. And then they did the count of it. I don't hate that. I think that's quite good. Complicated, but it's not really complicated, but it is advanced. And then they've included the pivot table, which is I suppose they're looking at the same data that I did, but I think my data looks a lot cleaner than this. This looks messy. It looks messy and it looks difficult to read. Whereas I think that mine is easier to read in this pivot table. But it is what it is. So they did pivot tables. This person did a regular table, no pivot tables, no charts. The only thing they did, I think, they didn't even sort the data. No, they did. They sorted the data by employee, it looks like. And then this is conditional formatting. And so they didn't fill these cells manually. What they did is they came to the Home tab with this range selected, and let's see what rule they applied. Graded color scale. Right, okay, so they didn't actually apply a function or a formula. What they did is they went to color scales and they picked one of these. And depending on the values in relation to one another, it gives it different formatting. So I quite like that. It's a little bit, I was going to call it lazy, but it's not really lazy. Personally, I'd highlight cell rules or top and bottom rules would have probably been my approach. And I would have said highlight any values in that range that are above like $100 or $150, and it would have left the rest unformatted. In your MOS exam, you're going to have to use one of these two sets of presets. And during the spring summer, the one that we saw was top and bottom rules, top 10 items or top 10%, but it wasn't 10, it was 5. They wanted you to identify the 5 highest values in that range. So if I say clear rules from selected cells, it goes back to its original formatting. And then if I come back in and say top and bottom rules, and I wanted just the top, say 7 to be formatted, so not top 10, I still have to come into the top 10 items, and then I would change it here to say I actually want to format the top 7 items and not top 10 items. I think in the MOS exam it's 5, and then I would tell it that I want to do either a custom fit or a custom format, or I would pick from one of these presets. And so green fill is not gonna stand out enough with the green table. Red, yellow would be better in this particular case. And so then it takes the 7 highest values and then fills it with some formatting so that you don't have to go and do it manually. Don't hate it, but a bit simple. This person used a regular table. This says regular table here, it's not a pivot table, with a slicer. You can also use slicers with regular tables. So if you wanted to filter this table to, say, transportation expenses only, then we can do that. So they used a regular table. They didn't do an awful lot else with the table, but they did turn off the filter in the header row. It also looks like, we turn this back on. It looks like this is conditional formatting. It is, and it says, does the cell contain Y? And if it does, then it's going to fill it with this green. Let's have a look at how they did it. Format only cells that contain. Okay. That's like doing, you can do this as a preset. You could come to conditional formatting, highlight cell rules, text that contains or equal to would work. You could use a formula to do it, but there are simpler ways of achieving the same thing. Don't hate it. It's not the worst thing I've seen. Don't love it, but I don't hate it. This is just the table, and then they've sorted by expense to client, which isn't something that I would have done. So that you get all the yeses together. Is that range? Does it have conditional formatting in it? It does. Cell contains Y. Okay, but then they've sorted it by the Ys, which is why it looks like this. This is arguably the weakest one that we've looked at so far. Regular table with a slicer, but a slicer for employee. People are making very, very similar decisions here. And then what have we got? We've got financial services, which is a table with a slicer for category. So that's identical to what most of those other people have done. But I can see here that it says slicer financial services. And so they also made a pivot table. However, selecting it, yeah, this is protected. This is locked, this workbook. Hope it's not got a password. Yeah, it doesn't want me to mess with it. So that's fine. So pivot table, 2 different slicers. One of them is this isn't, in fact, this isn't a slicer. This is called a timeline. If I go back to my file, we could include, because we have date type data, we can access the timeline function. You won't be able to access timeline. It'll be grayed out normally, unless you've got data that's date type, date and time based. And we do. We've got a field full of dates. They all happen to be April, but it means that we can include a timeline type filter too. And so it'll only give you the option to use fields that contain the correct type of data. It would insert like this. And then obviously it's horizontal. This is the whole year. So if you wanted to see July's records only, you could click on July, August, March's, and then April's. All of our values are in April. So if you click on any other month here or specify a range that doesn't include April, then it won't actually give you any values at all. But this is the timeline. It's just another type of filter, and you can switch between filter into years, filter into quarters, which would then give you 4, right? All of our values are in quarter 2, none are in quarter 3, none are in quarter 4, none are in quarter 1, or days, which is if you wanted to look at a specific date, then that would be the way to approach it. But otherwise, months would probably be more appropriate. I don't know that a timeline really makes sense to use with this data. It depends what you're doing it. It depends what you're doing with it. You can, it's fine. I don't know that it's the choice that I would make. But that's what that student did. They used the timeline as well. Was it the last one? This one? Yeah. They used the timeline as well. And so I've got to give them marks for including the functionality. That presumably they correctly identified that because they have date type data, you can use a timeline. And so that's what they've done. So everyone's kind of doing similar things. I'd probably leave this worksheet like this, but without that timeline. I think this is an appropriate answer. And then I would move on. I'm not actually going to demonstrate anything in these other worksheets. Because I'm not here to do the assignment for you, but I want to point a couple of things out. There are like blank rows. You need to tidy up the data. These cells shouldn't be filled with this color. Anything where you've got blank columns, ideally needs to be populated with an answer. So calculations are going to happen. The representative in this particular worksheet is a different person by department, and you have that data up here. These are the wrong way around, by the way. Department should be an A1, HR representative as the heading should be an A2. This is effectively a second table that's horizontal in its layout, and so you could answer the representative by using HLOOKUP, and then asking it to look for the department as the lookup value in this range of cells, and then return from the second row, which would give you the name of the representative. Or what a lot of students did, because they don't like HLOOKUPs, you could take this data and you could transpose it. Transpose rotates the data. Department is supposed to be here. So that's department. And then this would be the HR rep. Let's wipe the formatting out of these cells because it looks hideous. Clear formats. Just bold these because they're headers for a second. So you could do this as a VLOOKUP. You could search for the value in column G in the first column. And so this would say OHR. It would stop in this row. And then you could return from the second column and get Karen as the representative. Or you could do it as a HLOOKUP with the range up here. Or you could do it as index match with either. It's up to you. Employment duration, most people are going to get measured in days. What I would normally do is I would take the today function, which resolves, let's have a look at what that number is, the 11th of the 11th, 2024. But what Excel actually sees in that cell is this number, 45,607. If that's today, tomorrow would be November 12th, 2024. And if I converted that date to a number, Excel would see 45,608. So it's one bigger than today. And that's because tomorrow is one day more on the calendar. It's one day later. And so this is what Excel actually sees when it looks at dates. If a date is formatted as number and not formatted to display a date. Which means that this value is a smaller number, right? 43,966. And so if we understand that, set it back to short date. If we understand that Excel actually just sees a numerical value that the date converts to, that actually represents the number of days since the start of the calendar that Excel is working with, which was the 1st of January 1900. That's how many days it's been as of that date since the start of the calendar. Then what we can do is we can say, use the today function, which is going to resolve to a bigger number than these earlier dates. And we can say, subtract that earlier date from it. Now, it might display as a date. It might not, because I changed that. I changed the number formatting of K5 to number, but it might display initially like this, right? 1904, which is clearly wrong. But as soon as you then set it to number, it represents the number of days between the join date and then the current date. And then we could copy these down. We'll get some wrong answers here where there are blank rows and there's nothing for it to calculate. But otherwise, this is the number of days. If you wanted to turn this into the number of months, but it's a rough answer, the number of months would actually be correct, but or rather the number of years would be correct, but the number of months could be slightly out. So it's a rough estimate. What you could do is you would say, take this number of days and divide it by 365. What did I do? Oh, I'm using the wrong keyboard. There we go. 365. And so then we would get a rough answer in years and then months. It's not accurate in months. It's not perfectly accurate in months. It's close, but it's not perfectly accurate in months. Obviously, there are 10 like point increments, like 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, all the way up to it hits like a whole number. Whereas the year divides into 12. And so you're going to get a number that represents an estimated number of months that's not 100% correct. But the number of years will be correct in most circumstances. I'll accept either answer here. I don't really care. There are more complicated answers that we could generate, but I think what most people will have done is the same thing. Today function minus the value in K5 divided by 365 in a single formula to get the decimal year and the number of months. Don't hate it. That's what I did initially. This is the employment duration in years. This, however, is complicated. This is crazy. You can see what they've done, and they've used the concat function to join the answers into individual cells. But that's a lot. This is a complicated answer. It's good, but and again, they've got years and then days. They don't have years and months and days, which would have been better. But they've tried to do some really quite clever Excel. Just because it didn't work out perfectly doesn't mean that they don't get no marks, because they will get some marks. This I think is dated if. Yeah, it is. This is technically the best answer that you could get, right? It looks a little bit messy because there's no spaces here. So you could introduce them, right? If I was going to fix this, I would do a space before years within the quotations, and then a space. Well, let's just do the space before for years, and then months, and then days, like that. So that spaces them out a little bit. But months, in fact, I don't think that worked. Did I not put it in? I did put spaces in the inside the quotations. Did I just? Yeah, I applied it to the first column. That's why the first row, and I didn't copy it down. So this is space before years, before months, and before days, which is good. But we also need a space after the comma. So after the comma is still inside the quotations. So after the comma, after the comma, after, we don't need one for the last one. Like that. That's better. So then you get an answer that you can read in years, months, and days. But it's required that they use 3 dative functions. They're using one dative function to deliver the answer in years. And then they've used an ampersand to combine a value that one function resolves to with another one. So this then gives you the same function, but we want the answer in months instead. And then we want the answer in years. And this ampersand allows you to combine the multiple things into a single cell. So we've got a function that works out the number of years, a function that works out the number of months that are left over, and then a function that works out the number of days that are left over. And then they've used the ampersand to combine them into single values. This is incredibly complicated. This isn't something that I demonstrated in my classes. This isn't something that you need to know how to do. This is really difficult, and I think they found this answer online. If you Google Excel calculate employment duration using dated if years, months, days, then it'll give you the formula. That's not a good enough reason to include it just because it's a good answer. If you don't really understand what's actually happening inside the function, and this is far more complex than we need to worry about. So I don't know that I would introduce. I'd do it like this. I'd probably just leave it as a decimal answer that represents the number of years and then the average number, a rough number of months, or I'd leave it as the number of days. I don't know that I would do this, but if you like the look of this and you want to challenge yourself, then you can go and try and figure it out. It's complicated, but it's not impossible. Someone else has done it here, and this one has got appropriate spacing. So this is a better answer, and it's the same thing. It's the dative function, and I'm pretty sure they all found the same web page, which is fine. There's not an awful lot I can do about it. The email you need to create. I would do this using something like concat or concatenate, one of those two functions, and I'd do it in the format that your school emails are in. So first name dot last name at something.ca or .com. And so I would say take their first name, add a dot in text 2, last name, and then in text 4 I would do at. You could do edu.state.ca, but there's no, these are like HR representatives for a company and they've got different positions, and I don't know that really makes sense. So I do something like mail or Gmail or mail.ca, just something simple, right? And what that would construct is an email address that's john.doe@mail.ca in that cell, and then I can generate email addresses for everyone using the same format. That would effectively answer this worksheet. I don't know that charts make sense in this worksheet because you're only really looking at either employment duration or you're looking at the salaries. But I'm sure you can figure out what you want to do with it. The management worksheet has some calculations that you need to perform as a bonus threshold. So you could do an if function, and bonus eligibility, the answer could be yes or no, or bonus or no bonus, or bonus or blank, and then calculate the bonus amount if it was 18% of the total, but only for the people that are going to get bonuses. You can see the spelling mistakes in this worksheet. I would probably do bonus amount as an if function, and I would say if the eligibility says yes, then take the total amount, multiply it by 0.18 to get 18%. And if it's false, then no bonus or it's blank. Marketing worksheet, I absolutely despise. I don't fully understand the data itself. And so what you do with it is completely up to you. Students did all kinds of stuff with the marketing worksheet. They introduced new data. They introduced some spark lines. They introduced data such as is it within budget? This is a screenshot of the goal seek tool, which is one of the items in the rubric. And they use this values to generate the answer, which looks quite good. Marketing, nice and simple one, just a table. Not a lot of marks for that one though. It's too straightforward. This one's a bit more complex. We've got cost overrun. We've got an over budget indicator. This is new data that they've introduced that didn't exist in the original file. If you're going to major in marketing, it might be that you can do some quite clever stuff with this data. It's up to you. And then they've got expenditures chart, which I quite like. Marketing, go away. Just a simple table, almost no marks for this. You'll get the marks for any calculations that need to be performed, but otherwise this is too simple. This is not a great answer. I mean, it's a fine answer. It's just I'll struggle to find you marks in the rubric that you haven't already picked up in another worksheet. Turning this into a table tells me absolutely nothing about what you can do in Excel, especially if you've already used tables in some of the prior worksheets, which you will do. Just using an extra table and then sorting the table by start date does nothing for me. Calculations you can get marks for, but other than that, you're not picking up any marks if this is what you submit. It's got to be more useful than this arrangement. Like this is better. They didn't introduce any new data up here, but they've done a pivot table underneath and then a pivot chart, which isn't great because you can't really read the sum of the conversion amounts at all, which is why they've included the data table as part of this so that you can see the actual values. It would be better if the sum of impressions wasn't included, I think. It wouldn't skew the rest of the values so much. The other values are so small that they can't, you look at them in comparison. They're all different. They could plot quite nicely, some of clicks and some of conversions, but because they're included with the sum of the impressions, that number is far too big. And so it makes the other two values draw on the chart significantly smaller, so small in this case that we can barely read it. It would have been better without sum of impressions included. Can I change it? I don't even think I can change it. I think it's locked. Oh no, maybe it's not. If I take off, oh no, I can't. It's not going to let me. Yeah, it's not going to let me remove it. I'd have to reselect the entire range of data. But they did some work. They included a pivot table, which is good, right? It's not a bad thing. And then the last person, marketing, no charts, not a table. First one that's not a table. That's a hyperlink. Who knows where that takes you? I'm not clicking it. A value missing. That's wrong. Got some cells with some sort of double underline formatting here. It's not double account and underline. I think it's just regular double underline. Obviously, that's wrong. And then they've got, this is conditional formatting. which I can't go into because the worksheet's locked. But this is one of the icons. And then I think this is new. I think this is a new column. They included a difference value, and then for some reason it's displaying the difference all as negative, which presumably is the budget versus total cost. So yeah, they're over budget on every single row. They're over budget, so it would be negative. Yeah, okay. Not a lot of marks for this. It's clean enough. Some mistakes in there. They've introduced one column of new data, but there's other stuff that you could do. But they also, it looks like, made a pivot table too, which looks incredibly messy. I don't like this at all. I wish this was not in the file. That's horrible. But it is what it is. So you've got options for each of these. And then the supply chain worksheet, you can probably figure out. There is some complicated stuff that you're asked to do in here. PMT function will be easy enough, especially once we've covered the financial functions. This says that it should be a drop-down list and pull the values from here. And so you would do that with data validation. You would say, I want a list, and I'll say the source data is right here. And then in that column, it then gives me piss off. Piss off. I hate comments. Go away. It gives me a drop-down list where I can change the value, and then I would use this with a function here, and I'd get it to look at this as its criteria in the logical test, and then sum the appropriate values. Doesn't tell you what the tax amount is, and so figure that out. What I will say is the sales tax in Alberta is 5%, and so don't even dream of telling me that you didn't know what to do with the tax. It's not talking about this APR up here. This is an annual percent rate. It's got nothing to do with sales tax. This is to calculate the quarterly payment amount. But I see a lot of students referencing this sub because it is an interest rate. That's not what tax is, and so we're not going to use that value for total with tax. If you do, I'll just give you 0. Product name, VLOOKUP is the way that I would do it. TSI02 or TSL02, TSI02 is a hoodie. TSI05 is mouse and keyboard. And so you could populate this entire column with a VLOOKUP. Also for the unit cost, VLOOKUP, because you've got the data here in that range. This is concat or concatenate or text join. You're making a combined order ID value that's unique based on the first letter of their name, so E, plus the supplier ID, so E 200474. This is it would be something like, what's the best way to do this? Equals concat. It's going to be the easiest way to do it. And then the left function. And if I step into the left function and say, oh, I've gone wrong somewhere here. What have I done? Concat left, text 1, Emily. From the left-hand side, we're extracting first letter, so just one character, so E. Step back into the concat function to get text 2, and text 2 is going to be the supplier ID, like that. First letter of supplier name plus the supplier ID would give you a unique identifier. Also, it's not the most unique it could be, but this will do for this example. Subtotal total with tax should be easy. A lot of students choose to completely change the layout of that last worksheet. This one looks the same, There's nothing particularly interesting in here. This one looks the same, but has got more elaborate formatting and some additional content down at the bottom, where they've introduced new data, got a payment function up here, drop down list, VLOOKUP minus a SUMIF. Oh, that's clever. So what they've done, there's an issue that I've got with this data because it's not perfect. In that, this says inventory and cost. So these are the inventory amounts. So what they've done is they've figured out how many have been ordered of that particular item, and subtracted it from the inventory value, and then this lets you know how many are still left, how many remain available. So that's quite clever. I quite like that. That's good work. It's good Excel. This they changed completely. This is what I was talking about. Some students elected to completely change the layout, the arrangement of the data, and you can do that if you want to move things around and manipulate the data. You're allowed to do that. If you're going to remove anything, you're going to need a good reason for it. Because when I grade your file, if I see that you've deleted content, I might not put a grade in. I might want an explanation from you, and you're going to have a good explanation. It can't just be random, and you didn't like the look of it, or you didn't know what to do with it. That's not good enough. You're going to need to provide me with an answer, or I can't give you marks. Nothing we do is random. We're working with data. The data is important. The data is king. I hate the formatting of this, but I don't hate the arrangement of it. Not really sure what they've done here. Oh my God. A sum product, a sum ifs, and two sum ifs. No, that's crazy. Don't do that. That's unnecessarily overcomplicated. This one looks straightforward. This one looks straightforward. It's got some conditional formatting in it. I don't know whether the answers are right, but they've got PMT. That's just the sum if, which is how I would have done it, I think. See, that says available by product ID, so maybe this isn't how I would have done it. That's how many have been ordered. And yeah, I would probably deduct it from the inventory, which requires a VLOOKUP. VLOOKUP, the answer from the VLOOKUP minus the answer from the sum if. I quite like what that other student did, because that's probably how I would approach it. And then, dear me, so many worksheets. And then there's the last one. They've changed the arrangement somewhat. They've duplicated it almost. Why would you do this? These are just sum ifs minus plus sum ifs. Oh my God. To get to the same answer. This is too complicated. Like VLOOKUP minus sum if would have done this. Because that's just 4,000 minus the 18 that were ordered that was t-shirts. They've done it a different way, which is fine, but this is more complex. This is not the approach I would have taken. It gives you the right answer. So then the answer should be 3,982, shouldn't it? It doesn't work. You can change the value in the drop down, but it doesn't work. So then the answer doesn't change. Can I type in there? No, I can't. Oh, because multiple sheets are selected. Hang on, let's ungroup sheets. Yeah, all right. 3,982. Perfect. So then they did some product, sum if. Okay, I wouldn't have done that. I would have done VLOOKUP minus sum if. But you get the same answer, and so it's correct. This is too grey. Don't understand why these underlines are being included in some of these rows. It doesn't make sense to do it here. I've got to imagine that they had those cells selected when they didn't even do the last row. Yeah, I don't know why this is underlined. Doesn't make sense. This is a counting underline. In fact, it's not accounting underline. It looks like it's regular underline. Yeah, so those are yours. So everyone's done slightly different things. And so that's the goal. You're going to take this this file. You're going to take this file inside the project, inside the assignment folder, and then work with the rubric and make edits to it. The goal really is your primary goal is to make the data look more presentable and do the calculations where the calculations need to be performed. Don't overcomplicate things for yourselves. Like keep it relatively simple. But you've got a good look at a range of options that's available to you for all of those worksheets in this video. And so there isn't one answer. So there's no answer key that I'm going to use. I'm going to analyze your file in a vacuum on its own against the rubric. And if you've done good work, then you'll pick up the marks. If you've done bad work, you'll pick up less marks. If you've done no work or not enough work, there'll be cases where you pick up no marks. It's not really any more complicated than the word capstone, which most people did a really good job with. And so pay attention to the videos that I'm posting to the announcements pane in Brightspace and to the YouTube channel, and work through the LinkedIn Learning content, because that will help you format the capstone file too. If you need some specific advice, or you want me to look at your file, you want to book a meeting with me, then we can do that. And we've got just over 3 weeks to finish this assignment. And so I'm going to call this video here, because this has already gone on for 2 hours and 40 minutes, which is far too long. But it is what it is. So I hope this was useful to some of you. Okay, good luck.